Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Doris. It's a privilege to introduce our speaker, who's a friend of mine. He's one of the leaders in Israel's battle of the mind, the intellectual battle for survival. We all know that Israel faces military threats. It's also threatened in the areas of law and in the media as its enemies attack its very existence. Some of those enemies are worldwide, some are in Israel itself. Professor Sion is one of the commanders in Israel's fight against those who would seek to delegitimize it. Professor Zion's got a law degree from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's got a PhD from Cambridge University. He spent he was in the I.D.F. and a lieutenant colonel, and he spent 17 years as a judge in Gaza, where he was able to observe enough that he could warn Prime Minister Shamir, whom he advised, and Shamir was one of perhaps the strongest of Israel's prime ministers in his history. He warned Prime Minister Shamir of the upcoming intifada as he sensed something was amiss. Professor Sion also is on the board of directors of many of Israel's largest corporations. He's an instructor of law, and his most important venture now, the latest one he's doing, is at the Ariel University Center. Ariel is about to be a full-fledged university. It's about a month away. It is in Samaria. It is controversial because it is across the Green Line. We know it's not in occupied territory, it's not in disputed territory, it's in liberated territory. But there are many people who object to the university simply because it's there. At Ariel University Center, soon to be Ariel University, Professor Sion has founded and is now the chairman of the Center for Law and Mass Media, which is focused on defending Israel from legal assault and from the assaults in the mass media and coming up with strategies to combat it. He has held annual conferences there. He's doing another one. This is a very, very important intellectual center and think tank. Afterward, I would urge all of you to talk to him or talk to me about supporting this Center for Law and Mass Media, because it is, again, this is critical for Israel's survival. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Abraham Sion.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to thank Doris and, of course, Steve Goldberg for the very nice words. Actually, I would like to say a few words which I found in the homepage of the Children of Holocaust Survivors. I don't have the exact text, but it says from Jabotinsky that for 3 years he was trying to warn Polish Jews of the plight that is coming over Europe in 1938. And his hair turned white after 3 years because nobody really listened to him. And we know what happened after 1938. We are in 1938. Israel is at a very critical stage. I would say that our situation after 63 years is not much better than it was in 1948. We made many mistakes. And one of the mistakes was the Oslo Accords, where Israel came to Arafat at his worst time in history and offered him to become a president of a state within Israel. You remember that Arafat, that was the Gulf War, and it was 1991, 1992, and he was thrown out of Kuwait, and nobody really wanted to have anything to do with him. When he would come to the United States for the conferences here, United Nations conference, he would be taken from the airport to the conference and then back and thrown away from the country. So we offered him to become president. And we wanted to achieve two things. First, that there will be an end to terror. And the second thing is that we will have peace and quiet and get rid of, say, 1.5 million or 2 million Arabs. But we did not achieve any of this. First of all, because terror became much stronger after the signing of the agreement, of the Oslo Agreement, and also because we did not get rid of anything. The demography remains the same. Now, if we want to see what is the outcome, what are the mishaps of the Oslo Agreement? Because if we don't know what's wrong with the Oslo Agreement, we cannot change our path. And as Steve pointed out, in the Center for Law and Mass Media, that's exactly what we are doing. We're doing research, and we're trying to find solutions, alternatives to the two-state solution, which is the biggest mistake that we've done. And really, there is no mistake that we haven't done so far. And all the Arabs have to wait is just for us to continue to make mistakes in order to lose the country. The Oslo Agreement was our initiative. Excuse me. The Oslo Agreement was our initiative. The withdrawal from Gaza was our initiative. And many other things are really our initiatives. It's not the Arab initiative. And we tried to convince the American administration that our way of thinking is the right way, which is not. So what happened with the Oslo Agreement? The first thing was that we lost all the holy places forever. When, for 2,000 years, when Jews were thinking about the return to the homeland, they were not thinking about Tel Aviv, they were not thinking about Netanya or Beersheba. They were thinking about the holy places, and mostly about Jerusalem, and Bethlehem, and Hebron, and Shechem. These were the places that we were yearning to go back to. And suddenly, a Jewish state gives it up. And to whom? To a nation that we created. There was no Palestinian nation. All the cultural, economical institutions in Palestine were Jewish. The Jerusalem Post and the Jewish Agency for Palestine, these were all Jewish institutions. There was no Palestinian, there was no Palestinian state. And suddenly, people who are 4,000 years old, 5,000 years old, Jerusalem being their capital, suddenly give up to someone who was created maybe 60 years ago, even less. So this was one big mistake that we've done. The second thing was that by going through this Agreement, suddenly Israel became Goliath, and the Palestinians became David, and they were the underdog. They were the ones that the world had to protect from the Israelis, while Israel is in a ghetto surrounded by 200 million Arabs. So when our struggle was against the Muslims and the Arabs, we were the underdog. Suddenly we became Goliath, and you can see the shift in treating Israel from looking at it as a victim to looking at it as an aggressor. This would not have happened if it weren't for the Oslo Agreement. The third thing was that for the first time, many Israelis and Jews around the world started looking at Israel at a countdown. In other words, the question was not whether Israel is going to stay forever, but the question was how many years Israel is going to last. I can tell you that since the Oslo Agreement, there has been a trend in Israel to get a second passport. This is very Jewish. When they feel insecure, we try to find places where a haven that we can run to. I remember once I was in Switzerland, and I was on a train, and I met a lady, and we started talking. I never saw her before. She said she was from Rhodesia, and that she left Rhodesia when the blacks took power. And she told me something which was at the time very interesting. She said, you know when I left Rhodesia? When the Jews started to leave Rhodesia, then I knew I was in danger. They know when they are in danger. So, this is one thing which is very important in the struggle. In other words, a country can topple down not by means of weapons, but by how strong you are to keep going amongst all the hazards that you have around. Then, of course, it depends how the other side interprets what we do. The other side did not see it as being appeasement of the Arabs. It was not translated as something that showed power. It showed weakness. And for the first time, the Arabs started feeling that Israel is at an end, and therefore all they have to do is to put up pressure, and they will achieve their goal. So actually, the Oslo Agreement, instead of bringing peace, maybe deferred peace for another 100 years. Because peace can only be had if the other side believes that they cannot possibly annihilate Israel. But when they think that this is a possibility, then there might be that the Arabs would feel strong enough to carry on the struggle. And of course, how does this whole thing look in the eyes of the world? If the Jews say that Judea and Samaria is an occupied territory, then the world would say, tell the Jews or the Israelis, why don't you give it up? If it's not yours, just get out of there. You yourself admit that Judea and Samaria is not Israel, then why are you keeping it? Suddenly, peace is not an issue. The issue is two-state solution. Nobody is talking about peace today. Nobody even believes that peace is possible. You know why, until now, what was the reason that Arafat did not accept Ehud Barak's offer? Ehud Barak offered 100% of the 1967 lines. When I say 100%, that means around 93%, and then exchange of territories for the other 7%, which means it's 100%, with control over the old city, also the Wailing Wall. And he said no. Why did he say no? He said no, first of all, because he wanted the refugees to go into the Green Line. Now, let's figure that. What exactly is he aiming at? We are giving him a state. And remember, Israel was the only country in the world who offered the Palestinians a state. The Palestinians were under Jordanian control for 19 years. They were under Egyptian control for 19 years. Nobody even thought from those two countries to give the Palestinians a state. Not only that, but Jordan annexed the West Bank to be part of Jordan, and nobody accepted that except for Britain and Pakistan for their own reasons. But even the Arab League, even the Arab countries did not accept that. And the West Bank was never Palestinian, there was never a Palestinian state. And yet Arafat refused because he wanted the refugees not to go to his country. Can you imagine that Israel was established and the Israelis would say, we want the Jews to go to America? It's the same thing. And when this happens, this is the delegitimization, sorry for the word, of Israel. Because if Israel says that these areas do not belong to us, then what is Israel doing here? Because if we take Palestine, for 2,000 years, was not a state, and Jerusalem was never the capital of any country, ever, except for the Jewish state at the time of David and Solomon. If we take this into consideration, then, thank you. If we take this into consideration, then what exactly is the balance between the Palestinians and the Israelis? Israel is only 63 years old, but Palestine is 2,000 years old. Don't forget that the Romans gave the name Palestine in order not to call it Judea. Now, in the eyes of somebody in Finland, or in Sweden, or in Africa, who knows a little bit of history, says, wait a minute, if you take the Atlas and go back far, 200 years, 300 years, it was Palestine. It was never Israel. So Israel is the new state, and Palestine was the old state. Therefore, the Israelis took it from the Palestinians. And you won't believe that the Palestinians now are saying that they are descendants of the Philistines who fought David at the time. Because with the Arabs, there is no problem whatsoever. They can tell the biggest lie without a wink. They have no problem at all. We have a big problem. And this is part of Hasbro, that we deal quite a lot. We call it public diplomacy. I was once approached by the Israel Defense Forces spokesman who was looking for people who could speak English or French or Italian for the foreign press. And he approached me if I would like to volunteer, and I said, with pleasure. But then we started talking on the phone. And there was, at that time, the Eldura case, you know, of the boy who was killed in a crossfire between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And of course, Israel was the first to admit that Eldura was killed by our bullets. So he asked me, what do you think about it? And I said, this was a grave mistake. He said, why? I said, are you sure that this happened? Can you be 100% sure? He said, there is no 100% sure. Then I said, then why admit if it's not 100% sure? And he said, you know, we are the Israeli Defense Forces, we cannot tell lies. And I said, you don't have to tell lies. You just don't have to admit something that you're not sure that you've done. And he said, you know what? I don't think we'll need your services. Another point here is that Israel brought in a Trojan horse. Now, no nation survived a Trojan horse. We brought in something like 100,000 people from Tunisia legally, because in the Oslo Agreement, or in the agreements that followed, we accepted 10,000 terrorists to come into Israel, into the West Bank and Gaza, which was Israel actually, with their families. Every Palestinian has a family, and a family means his father and mother and his children, which are around 10 people, so it's about 12 people coming in. Now, if you multiply 10,000 by 12, you get 120,000. The law of return. They all came in to a country which has no borders. There were no borders. And they were allowed to carry weapons. And they used to make the tours in armored cars together. 2 or 3 Israelis and 2 or 3 Palestinians. At some time, they used to have coffee in the morning, and the Palestinian would take his gun and shoot the Israeli. Just like that. And it happened once and twice. And they stopped these tours, these car tours. But I'm trying to show that we brought in not just a foreign army, but terrorists into Israel with no borders. So what happened soon after that is that people were blown up in buses, in cafes, in cinemas, and other places. And if you try to imagine what that means, for example, for me as a father, to have my children go by bus to school and not be sure that they're going to come back. And I even, at times, felt very guilty that my children are going by bus and I'm going by my private car. And I'm safer than they are. And it's sometimes people were blown up 3 generations at a time. In a cafe, in a restaurant in Haifa, It's a restaurant I used to go to. I still go to. On my way to Haifa from Haifa, I stopped by. A young woman, Arab, dressed very well, very nicely, entered the cafe. She sat near a family who were the grandfather and grandmother and the son and the daughter-in-law and their two grandsons. And she ordered, and after she ordered, she blew herself up. 3 generations went just like that. And the world doesn't care. The world is silent. The world comes up only when Palestinians are killed. I could imagine what would have happened if the Palestinians were in the Congo and they would have fought an African tribe. Nobody would have heard about them. Even if 1,000 were killed, nobody would have heard about them. The world hears about the Palestinians only because they're fighting Jews. That's where the press becomes interested. That the Jews are fighting the Arabs, and sometimes they ask, how come that in a skirmish there is 1 Jew killed on every 10 Arabs? There's no balance. There must be balance in killing. Justice. So that's because what we are. And as I say, the Oslo Agreement actually changed the United Nations resolutions, Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Because after the 6-day war, when 242 was accepted by the whole world, also by the Arabs, it said that for real peace, Israel would withdraw to secure boundaries, not give up all the territories that were taken in the 6-day war, but part of the territories. And the legal profession, the people or the lawyers, have written that again and again there was an attempt to have this 242 apply to all territories. But it said territories and not the territories or all the territories. Now we withdrew from all Sinai. And we withdrew from parts that we had from Jordan. So we actually gave up more than 85% of the territories that we captured. Nobody even thought that we should give up all Judea and Samaria. And there was nothing said about the Palestinian State in the 242 resolution. When we came over and offered to make peace with the Palestinians, we actually gave up our right on 242 and 338. And this was another mistake, I would say. But not only that, the moment our struggle was against the Palestinians, we lost a lot of contentions that we had. For example, exchange of civilians and exchange of, say, confiscation of lands or of property. What I mean is, all wars, every war, has exchange of population. You know, at the Second World War, many Germans were expelled from Poland. Many Polish were expelled from the Ukraine. These are things that happen at wars. At war, when there was war between Turkey and Greece, there was the exchange of population. Many Turks who lived in Greece were expelled to Turkey, and many Greeks who lived in Turkey were expelled to Greece. Only here they speak about the refugees. In Israel, there are 6.5 million Jews, out of whom 6.2 million are refugees. Actually, all the Jews are refugees. And half of them are refugees from Arab countries who left their property much more than the property that the Arabs left when they fled Palestine at the time of the 1948 war. So when we have a struggle against the Arabs, we can put that up. But when we have struggle against the Palestinians, we cannot tell the Palestinians, look, we were expelled from Iraq and we were expelled from Egypt, and therefore it's right that you were expelled from Palestine. Actually, the struggle is not between Israel and the Palestinians. The struggle is between the Jews and the Arabs. Because if we don't see it this way, and we make peace, say we managed to succeed in making peace with the Palestinians, supposing. Now, who are the Palestinians? Suddenly you have Hamas, who say we don't recognize this agreement. And you try to appease the Hamas and make more concessions, and then the Hezbollah comes and says, look, we don't accept it. And after the Hezbollah comes the jihad, and after the jihad you have other terrorist organizations, and you have Iran, and you have other places, and you don't finish with it. I mean, it's impossible to come to any agreement that will end the conflict. When a few years ago, Mahmoud Abbas, who is the so-called president of the Palestinian Authority, was asked, if you get everything you want, everything you name, you get, is this going to be the end of the conflict? And he said, no. Nobody can end this conflict. The conflict has to do with a sacred land that the Arabs can never give up. So when people, an Israeli government, which was liberal Israeli government, thought that by establishing a Palestinian state, the conflict is going to come to an end, it was a mistake. It's actually a religious war. And with a religious war, you never end it. Not in our generation. Now, I'm not trying to be so pessimistic. I'm not trying to be so pessimistic because I'll tell you why. I believe that in the end, not in my generation, there will be peace. But that is only when the Arabs will accept a Jewish state in the Middle East. This is not going to happen now. It's not going to happen in the next generation. But it's going to happen in the end. And if you see the history of the world, if you see the wars between Norway and Sweden, which lasted over 200 years, and between France and Germany, then you say, even between the worst enemies, peace will come in the end. But it won't happen now. And if it won't happen now, let's see what we can do. Not just give more, waive more rights and give more territory and put ourselves in jeopardy. But what we can do is to look at things in a practical way. That's what we are doing in Ariel, in the Center for Law and Mass Media. We're trying to figure out the hazards, and we're trying to look forward in the next 10, 20 years to see what are the problems that should be tackled and should be known today. I can tell you, I can say that because I've written about it and I have proof of what I'm saying. That's why I can sort of brag to say, I envisaged what's happening today in 1993. In 1993, I said that the Oslo Agreement is going to lead to a Palestinian state. Nobody believed me. They thought that I was talking nonsense. And some of the members of parliament, Israeli Knesset, asked Shimon Peres at the time, in the beginning of 1994, things are being written. I wrote in the papers at the time. I also published a pamphlet. And he was asked, they say that this is going to lead to a Palestinian state. Is that true? And he said, no. This is impossible. You know why? Because we won't agree. And a Palestinian state cannot be established without our consent. Now you can see how naive this was, to think that a Palestinian state requires the consent of Israel, and without the consent of Israel there will be no Palestinian state. So the question is, what's going to happen in the next 20 years? Now we have Iran, we have Turkey, and we'll have many other hazards. But the core of the problem is the Palestinian problem. In other words, the struggle on the same land by two nations. One nation who was actually the owner of this land, and not only the owner, but also they were promised the land. Now, when I say promised the land, I can tell you that we cannot disregard the Holy Scriptures. Israel never made a big case about it. But if you go all over the world, and I really like to go to churches in Europe, for example, wherever I go, if I see a nice church, I just go in. Even in the Vatican. The Bible is open on a high stand. And in the Bible it says it's the land of Israel. And when you turn the pages, you see Israel on every page. So when you speak to the Christians, when you speak to the cultured world about the Bible, about the promised land, they understand. The trouble is that we never make an issue out of it. But the Arabs do. The Arabs say it's their land, and their land was confiscated, and they are the victims, and they were thrown out, and our public diplomacy is very poor. I was involved in politics. I didn't want to go to the Knesset, but I was involved in politics. I was a member of the Central Committee of the Likud Party. And the trouble is that even the Likud and Israel Beitenu, that's the right-wing parties, never really thought that Hasbro is important. And I can tell you that out of $100 billion, which is the budget of Israel per year, only 10 million goes on Hasbara, on PR, on explaining the situation. And therefore, this has to be changed. I'm working on it, but it's taking time. I've spoken a number of times to the foreign minister, and he says, you're right, we have to change the situation, we need more money, and so forth. But actually, this can only come from the rank and file. It can only come from below. It can only come from the people. It can come from the academic field and towards convincing the right people, the decision makers. And actually, we are having a conference on the 2nd of April, as Steve stated. And the reason for the conference are actually 3 items. One of them is the Supreme Court. In Israel, the Supreme Court has unlimited power, not unlike any other country in the whole world. I mean, in the Western world. No, I think in the whole world, because in totalitarian countries, the courts really have no power. But in a democratic country, the Supreme Court has enormous power in Israel, and this is something that has to be also changed and investigated. The other thing is the alternatives to the two-state solution, which is the main theme, and this is actually something that we are trying to carry on in the future to bring a change in public opinion, also not only in Israel, but also in the Western world, and particularly in the United States. And that's what I'm here for, to explain this, that there are alternatives to this two-state solution. I'll tell you what I think. And it's not new. The country of the Palestinians can only be Jordan, because Palestine, by the Balfour Declaration, included the West Bank, west of the River Jordan, and east of the River Jordan. What Britain did sometime in 1922, that it decided to tear out from Palestine, to tear out Jordan, which was about 70% of the territory. 80% of Jordan are Palestinians. So it's a matter of time that the Palestinians will take over. And when they take over, then there is a home for the Palestinian people. This is also one of the mistakes that we've done at the time, when we helped Hussein, King Hussein, to overcome Black September. Because at that time, the Palestinians were about to take over. And it's only our tanks who came to the border that did not make this happen. So Jordan is Palestine. And at the moment, until this happens, the Palestinians in the West Bank will have full autonomy. Of course, full autonomy, but under the inspection of Israel. Israel will have to annex the West Bank. It's unthinkable that the University of Ariel would be left to the Palestinians. It's the University of Ariel has now 12,000 students. It's in a city of 20,000 people. It's not a few tents with a camel. I don't know how many of you have been to Ariel. How many have been to Ariel? Anybody? Very good. Well, it's 2 or 3, but I'm inviting you to Ariel. If you happen to come there, you can call me up, and I'll be glad to show you a real new university with labs, with research, and with student life that can match any other university in the United States or in Europe. And even today, even at the time that Ariel is a high standard university, we are having problems with other universities who are boycotting Ariel. I had an experience a month ago when a colleague of mine was registered in a conference in Germany. And after some time, he received a letter saying that he cannot take part in the conference because he lives in Ariel, and Ariel is an occupied territory. Now, this is fantastic. So he showed me the letter, and I answered them and said, it's amazing that a German university in a German territory is preaching Israel about occupation. After some time, he received a letter saying that he can participate in the conference. But the whole thing was ridiculous in a way of occupied territory and boycott. I am very hopeful, and I think that Ariel University is there to stay, and we will be able to change public opinion and to see Israel as a Jewish state, and the Oslo Agreement abolished by us, and we will take a different path. But of course, we'll need the help of every person that believes in Ariel and believes in the Center for All Mass Media and what we are doing. And any help will be, of course, very much appreciated. And I thank you. Thank you very much.
I had a question about the existential threat from the Arab Israelis that live inside Israel, if you could comment on that.
Sorry?
The Israeli Arabs that live within Israel, if you could comment on that, the existential threat it poses to Israel. And also, are there Arabs that attend the university in Ariel?
Good question. The Arabs in Israel have full freedom, but because of the Oslo Accords, they became more and more Palestinians. I taught in Haifa University for some years, and there you have 30% Arabs, and the Arabs in the last 15 years or 10 years started becoming on a nationalistic level. In other words, they would wave the Palestinian flag, and they would say that they do not belong to Israel, even though they are studying in a Jewish institution, and sometimes on the places that could be given to Jewish people. In other words, there is a quota, but different than the quota that was in Poland before the war. In other words, we are accepting Arabs on a lower level because we want to have more Arabs in universities. And they are becoming more and more extremists in this. I would say more than that. The Arab leaders at the moment are working very hard in changing the structure of Israel. In other words, they're trying to change the Israel into the land of the Arabs and the Jews, that they will have same rights as the Jews. In other words, they will have the law of return, and that no law would be accepted in parliament without they have a veto on any law that affects them in any way. They're trying to work on it, and they're doing it quietly and in a sophisticated way. If we do have Arabs in Ariel, we do. We have Israeli Arabs, and you won't believe it, but we have Palestinians as well from East Jerusalem. So the Ariel University actually has a wide range of Jews and Arabs, and they live in harmony. We have Ethiopians, and we have Russian origin Jewish students, and we have all kinds from all levels and from all Israel. And also, we have taken students also from East Jerusalem who are actually Palestinians. In other words, they are not citizens, but they live in East Jerusalem. They vote for the Arab Parliament, but they live in East Jerusalem. This way? Okay.
I have two questions. Quickly, if the Oslo Accords were rejected, can't we go back to ground zero? Is that precedent? That's number one.
So if they were rejected, what happened? Yeah?
And why do we still refer to that as a precedent? Why does it still carry power if it's been rejected by the Arabs? But more importantly, I think the people in this room, certainly I, as a student of Islam now for the last 10 years, seem to know more about Islam, and that they're dedicated to the destruction of all Jews. It's in their holy books. The people in this room know more about it than what I see from the Israeli leaders. Why don't they talk about that? Why don't they just open the books and say, look, how can we make peace with people who want to kill us? It's impossible.
Yeah, that's a case that we are actually dealing with. In other words, as I said, it's a religious war, or if you like, it's a holy war. And amongst the Muslims, they cannot accept a Jewish state in that area, not now, and not in our generation, not in the next generation.
Yes, I wanted to ask also two questions. One is about Jordan as being a possible homeland for the Palestinians. My question is, we now have two generations since '67 who have grown up, Palestinians who have grown up, believing, being told by their parents that their ancient homeland was stolen from them in '48. And they grow up with this myth, and they are no longer lying because they believe that that's the reality. And they've been told that their country, their Jerusalem, and the country they need to have is theirs. So what would possibly persuade them to suddenly turn around and go to Jordan and become swallowed up in another, even though they're Palestinians, they regard Palestinians as being in exile? So that's the one question. The other question I wanted to ask you was about PR. You spoke about the importance of PR. And several wonderful people like yourself coming here and talking to us, but you're talking to the choir. We want to know how you can infiltrate the universities with maybe political programs just like the Palestinians do, and reach people other than ourselves who are meant to be your target.
Right. The first question was, tell me again.
Jordan.
Yeah.
Can we try and keep to one question so that he doesn't have to remember two? Please.
You know, the Oslo Agreement was signed 18 years ago. And since the Oslo Agreement, there has been a lot of incitement with the new generation. This is one of the best proofs that the Arabs never intended to make peace with the Jews. Never. How do you know that? When you teach your young generation that the greatest esteem they can get to is by being a shaheed, by blowing themselves up in buses and in cafes, killing as many Jews as possible. And you teach that to them from the age of 1. When they get to 18, then they are determined to kill Jews. So that is the lackmus of telling us that the Arabs never intended to make peace with the Jews. What I suggest is, and I was in Gaza before the Oslo Agreement. Before the Oslo Agreement, the Arabs did not like us. They did not love us. But they respected us, and they were afraid of us. And they did not think that it is possible to kill Jews. I can tell you that as an officer in the army, I used to walk the streets of Gaza without any fear. I would go to any restaurant and have a hummus and tahina and falafel, and they would say thank you if I gave them, when I paid him. So we can go back to this. How do we go back to this? We just, what my philosophy is that we should abolish or leave the Oslo Agreement, annex the West Bank, and leave those places of where the Arabs are as autonomous places under Israeli control. Then you can inspect the teachings and the books of whether it's the teachings or the other activities that they do, to bring them back to what they were before. I don't mean that they're going to love us, I don't mean that they're going to be Jews, but they are going to stop this incitement and at this level. If this happens, then there is a chance that within one generation things will go back to what they were. And this is one of the things that we have to start doing now. But of course, this is not an easy thing. Let me tell you that to go back to what was before is not an easy thing. It's not going to be accepted by the world, but there will be no alternative. It's going to be either now or next year, but it has to be at this time, because we cannot leave things as they are. And the other question was, remind me, the PR. Yeah, we are preaching to the preached. I mean, to the, yeah, I know what you mean. I tell you, I did not come to convince you to be Zionists. What I'm trying to do is to get the help of people in the United States. And I'm doing this in the West, in the East Coast and in the West Coast. The idea is to have enough power to convince the Israeli government to put in PR not $10 million, out of which $6 million goes on salaries and $4 million a year is as the budget of PR, but to have $3 billion go on Hasbro. If we can do this, the whole thing will change. And we can do a great deal in campuses in the United States and in Europe. We can do a great deal if we have enough funding for that. But this has to come from the Israeli government. How do you change the Israeli government thinking is what we are trying to do in the Center for Law and Mass Media.
I thank you for coming, and I will visit Ariel this summer when I come.
You visited Ariel?
I will visit.
Oh, that's great.
It made me, I'm making a promise. I do have two questions, and I apologize. Number one, when you say you need our help, what exactly do you want from us? Give us the recipe of what you need from us. And number two, I have friends who live in Israel. I was born there. One of them is a nurse who works for the government. And her friends who are Israeli Arab women who would dress Western style like we do, went and did Hajj, is that what it's called, going to Mecca, and came back very Orthodox, changing and dressed all covered up. What are we doing about the education within Israel? Forget about the Arabs who are on the West Bank. Something is going on within Israel that the Arabs are being pulled. They used to be very westernized, they used to be very modern, and they're pulled back to the fanatic Islam. And when nobody's watching, nobody's doing anything about it?
Right. Now, of course, the main help that we are expecting is funding our purpose. Funding means to believe in what we are doing. It's not just giving on money, but the idea is that you believe in what we are doing, the importance of what we are doing, and funding would help us carry out all sorts of activities that we cannot do, even though most of our people who are working on this are volunteers. But funding is very important for any activity that we want to do, whether it's publishing pamphlets, publishing articles, bringing the thing to the knowledge of the people, having PR people work for us, and getting to the radio and television in Israel, also to the papers. This is a costly affair. So any funding that can happen, of course, you could approach Steve, you could approach me. We have pamphlets on the table. You are welcome to have them. There is a lot of information about what we are doing. You will have our telephone number. And I'm also very glad to give you my card, so you can have contact with me directly. This is very important, and I hope that this will take place. Now, as to the Arab Orthodox teaching, Israel is a free country, and you can practice your religion any way you like. It's true that the schools in Arab villages are becoming more and more religious, but they are under the inspection of the Israeli government, with a difference than the Palestinians. It's very difficult to stop an Arab becoming more religious, it's very difficult to stop a Jew from being more religious. And when you are in a democratic country, there's nothing you can do about it. Yeah?
What I want to say is with the broad picture of solving...
Sorry, could you raise your voice, please?
I'm asking broad picture of the future. In the Quran, which most of us are familiar with it in this room, they hate the Christians almost as much as they hate the Jews.
Right.
The Jews are a very small group of people. The Christians occupy at least a third of the world. So why are the Jews so reluctant to align themselves with the Christians in their fight against Islam? Because that's what it is. It's a war against Islam.
Well, I don't think that the Jews are not aligning themselves with the Christians. I think there is a lot of give and take between the Jews and the evangelists and Christians in the United States. There's great help. You know that we have in Ariel a lot of funding from Christians, like Pastor Hagee and others, who have been giving quite largely to Ariel. And I don't know what exactly, are you referring to something particular, that there is no alignment with the Christians?
Yes, I have spoken to, I feel, take the universities on campus at UCLA, for instance. I've spoken to, some of the, they have these Muslim studies on campus, and then the Jews will get together and have a couple of protests. But if they would align themselves, even at UCLA, with the Christian students and try to do something against these Muslim seminars that they have, I think they'd have a lot more success just because of numbers. You know, that's an example.
Well, I'm sorry to say that you find anti-Semitism among Jews. And we have a larger problem among Jews than we have with Christians. You know, when I participate in international conferences, I have no problem with the Arabs or with the Muslims or with the Christians. My problem is with the Jewish colleagues that I have from Tel Aviv University or from Jerusalem, because when I speak, and in every conference, it doesn't matter on what, whether it's chemistry or it's physics or it's political science, the theme, the Arab, the Palestinian problem comes up. They always take care of that it comes up. And therefore, you have to answer them. And I find my problem is with my colleagues, not with the Arabs, because I can tackle the Arab conversation. It's very difficult to tackle the my Jewish colleague friends. So I think that there is. I don't see the problem with the Christian community, but I'm willing to investigate that and see what can be done. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, except one thing that you said, we're going to have peace, but not in our generation.
Sorry? What?
Okay. Yeah, I agreed with everything you said, except one thing.
Yeah.
You said we're going to have peace, not in our generation.
Yeah.
I think we're not going to have peace at all. I mean, as long as they're as Muslim and thinking their way that they hate the Jew and they hate the Christian, we're not going to have peace. The other questions, I mean, I agree with what she said about the Christian, not the Jewish with the Christian, but the government, the Israeli government. I mean, we are the Copts from Egypt. And we are trying to work, I'm trying to work with the Jewish or the Israeli government, with the Coptic in Egypt, against, especially now in Egypt, the Muslim brother who's taking over. And they don't want to even talk to me. They are afraid that Egypt will think that we are the Israeli helping. That. Yeah, but no, I'm just making a comment. What she said about the yeah, do you see these things? I mean, in Israel with the Israeli government, that they don't want to work with the Copts in Egypt against the Christian, against the Muslim.
Well, I'm not very familiar with this, but I can tell you that Israel is helping those who are fighting our enemies. In other words, if you take the Kurds in Kurdistan, you know, Israel is giving them a lot of help. And you find Israel working in destinedly in various parts of the world. So I'm not very familiar with the Copts in Egypt. Maybe it's something new. You told me that you want to talk to me after this session, so we can carry on.
There are many, in Israel, there are many Orthodox Jews. What is the position, if they have a common position to what you're discussing tonight among the Orthodox Jews?
If they have a common discussion?
If they have a common position on what you're advocating tonight.
Well, it's difficult to speak about the Orthodox as one, they have one color, they're one entity, you know, you have Chabad and you have Nitorei Karta, and you have all sorts of Orthodox Jews. You have Orthodox Jews who believe in Netzach Israel, in the existence of Israel, and will fight for Israel, and there are Nitorei Karta and Mea Shearim who think that Israel should be annihilated. I mean, they go with the Arabs. You find, for example, that Ahmadinejad used Orthodox Jews for his campaign against the Israel and against the Jewish people. So you cannot speak about Orthodox Jews as one, as if they were one entity. But on the whole, most Israeli Orthodox people are for Israel. They serve in the army. They are dedicated. And take the Mafdal, for example, those who have the kippah, and they are very good soldiers. They believe in the Bible. They believe in Israel, and there's no problem with them. You're talking about a very small section of people who are against the state of Israel. There's nothing we can do about it. As I said before, it's a democratic country, and as long as you don't do any felony or you don't cross the law, then you're okay.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
I'm from Israel, and I served in the army, Six-Day War. And when you talked about that you believe that there will be peace one time, I can say that I cannot believe that there will be peace because there is so many groups of Arabs that if you deal with the Fatah, there will be the Hamas. If not the Hamas, the Falangot. If not that, the Shi'in. It means you cannot deal with them because there are so many. And I want to hear how you can deal with all the groups. That we have peace, really peace. Because I want peace because my children serve in the army, I serve in the army, and we don't see any hope solution. And I live now in north of California. I'm only visiting here. And we can see more than half of the group, the Jewish community, they are mostly believe with the Arab.
They are mostly?
Believe with the Arab, the innocent Arab, and we are the sharks. That's what I see there, and I'm like there, fighting with them. It's mean verbal, fighting with them, and I'm upset, and sometimes I don't go to. That's it.
Yes, this is one of the things I mentioned, that the conflict is not between Israel and the Palestinians, it's between Israel and the Arabs. When the Arabs as a whole will accept Israel in the region, and they will know that Israel cannot be annihilated, then there is a prospect of peace, not before then. So when you're talking about these groups, let me tell you that the groups that you know today are not necessarily the groups like that you're going to know 10 years from now, because they're always new groups. I can tell you, for example, I was in a Gaza prison as a judge to see prisoners for extension of their stay in prison. So they brought somebody to me, and I asked, who is he? And they said, he's Hamas. I didn't know what Hamas was. I never heard of the word Hamas. So in 1985, Hamas was not there. In 1985, when I had to extend his stay in prison, and they said, the Shabak said that he's Hamas. I said, who is Hamas? What is Hamas? And this is, it's a new organization. So in 10 years from now, you might have another 10 new organizations on top of the organizations of today. So there's no ending to it, and I agree with you. But if the Arabs, sometime, maybe in 3 generations, maybe in 2 generations, maybe in 4 generations, I don't know, I cannot say that there will never be peace, because there's always peace in the end. It might take 4 generations, it might take 1 generation. We have been at war for 100 years, and maybe we'll be at war another 100 years. Unless there is peace between Arabs and the Jews, there will never be peace. I agree with that.
I found when I was in Israel last October, from Badachad to Arad, Jerusalem, whenever I talked to groups of Jewish people, they were split relatively 50-50. Those on the left, or the far left, or the religious left, were understanding, appreciating the Arab narrative of events. My conclusion of that is not necessarily to overcome their arguments, but left me puzzled that their education within Israel is flawed. So my question to you is, how do you straighten out that flaw?
Again, I must say, Israel is a democracy, and we have to respect it. The Jews are a unique people. If you have 3 people sitting with one with the other, you would have 4 opinions, and they are different. So this is something innate in the Jewish people. You cannot change it. Now you have, from the extreme left to the extreme right, and you have political parties according to the spectrum, from the extreme to the extreme, and in the middle. Now you have people dedicated to each idea, but you have people that can change their minds. In other words, they float above, and this is the main thing. So you can see that, say 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, even though buses were blown up, there were more people in Israel who believed in the 2-state solution. Today you have many less people believing in the 2-state solution. And I would say that if we disregard the Arab political parties, they form 10 members of parliament, which is less than 10% at the moment. If we disregard them, there are more Jews who disbelieve in the 2-state solution than those who do believe in this 2-state solution. So there is a shift of ideas, and all we have to do is to strengthen this shift, because this is reality. Those people who still believe in the 2-state solution, they are in a sort of a dream or a wishful thinking. And when you have leaders who are in a wishful thinking and in a dream, then we are in danger. This is actually what happened to Shimon Peres and Begin. They believed that this is going to be the end of the conflict, and they thought they are going to go to the mausoleum as the great leaders of the country. Now, if you ask Peres, with his hand in his heart, he would tell you the truth. He would tell you that this was a big mistake, as he does say to the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. He says that it was a big mistake to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Well, thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed this evening, and I hope you did. Thank you.